Okay. All right. Anybody have any questions before we start? Yes.
What email is it?
What's that?
Is the email on the
The email address on syllabus, jcunningham18 at gsu.edu. That's the email that I am required to use for all communication between you and me. jcunningham18. Don't send it by way of iCollege. I just don't have time to check it. I have 3 email accounts to check, and I try to tell them, don't send it by iCollege. Send it by jcunningham18 at gsu.edu. And yes.
Once we hand you the paper, so we don't need to send you an email, right?
You can email it. Yes, if it's not ready today, you can email it before Monday. I'll give you that
I mean,
much.
I
Yeah.
If it's ready, can we turn it in today?
Turn it in now if you have it
Do we
ready.
get the extra point?
Huh?
Do we get the extra point? if it's turned
Yes,
in?
yes, indeed. Turn it in now. I'll be happy to take it. And if you have yours,
Yeah, I have give.
Oh, you gave it to us.
But
Huh?
I mean, we need to send you an email as well the papers.
no, you don't. No, don't do it. If you've given me a hard copy, don't send it by email. But actually, I'll tell you something. For those of you who send it by email, I'm willing to do it for you, but I have to print it up myself at my own expense. So, but it won't break me up financially, so I'm willing to do it. But okay, now all I just said is being recorded. I can cut it out when I edit the tape, edit the video. You hear me? I use the word tape. That's what's called an anachronism. Anachronism, just like using the word film. I'm neither using film nor tape. Yeah, anachronism. Living the past. All right. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, we've got a lot of ground to cover. Little time to cover it in. Let's get started. Your book opens up with a vignette about Frances Owens. She was just an ordinary woman, a widow woman, and a very poor widow woman. But one day a news reporter put her picture in the front of her magazine, in front of this news reporter's magazine, and Frances Owens became a national figure. The picture was of her working really hard, and so the news reporter kept coming back because her picture on the magazine made money for the reporter, you know. So the reporter kept coming back, and Florence Owens became fairly popular. The pictures show her working hard to feed her 6 children. Her husband was deceased, but he left her with 6 children, and she became a famous person as a result of her picture appearing in a magazine taken by a reporter. And the picture of her is in the book. Opposite of her, though, as far as economic, was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was from the aristocracy. He was rich. He was often hated by other rich people. He was called a traitor to his class. Anyway, he was an only child. I'll say this. His father got rich by trading opium to China, which was very, very low way to make money. But nevertheless, that's in the record. His father traded in opium and got millions of dollars. And Franklin was the only child. He was 5th cousin to Theodore Roosevelt, which means he was a 5th cousin to Eleanor. Eleanor Roosevelt was the niece of President Theodore Roosevelt. When Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor were married, President Theodore Roosevelt gave her away. I don't know why her father didn't. Maybe her father was deceased, but anyway, the president gave her away. The one thing, though, Franklin Roosevelt chose to be a Democrat instead of Republican, like Theodore Roosevelt was, and I don't know why, but I will say this, folks. If you want to win in politics, a lot of times it's best to belong to the party that's out of power, because the party in power is sooner or later either going to louse up or be the victim of something beyond their control, and they're going to become unpopular, and people turn to the opposite party. So sometimes it's best to belong to the opposite party than the one that's in power. Again, for whatever reason. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his marriage went a little sour when he had an affair with his secretary, and eventually that affair was to last till the day that she died. She died before he did. And eventually Eleanor got to where she approved of it. But the marriage then became just a mere convenience. And in fact, she actually threatened to divorce him, which if she would have done it in those days, he would never have become president of the United States. That again, morality was different then than it is now. In 1920, he ran for vice president. Yes.
Are we on chapter 24?
Chapter 24, yes, about the opening vignette about, anyway. Anyway, in 1920 he ran for vice president on the Democratic ticket. He campaigned energetically, and a lot of people believed that he had a bright future. Now, he lost badly, but at least he got his name in front of public eye. People would ask him, "Are you Theodore Roosevelt?" Well, no. He'd say, "I'm not Theodore. Theodore is my cousin." But he lost badly in 1920. Again, the political winds are blowing the other way, but he had nothing to lose because, after all, his party didn't have a chance to win in 1920 anyway. Now, 12 years later, the opposite was true. His party could hardly have lost in 1932. However, in 1921, he suffered from polio. At 30, he was 39 years old, and from that day till the day he died, he was never able to walk again, except sometimes he could take a few really, really painful steps. He tried to cover up his polio as best he could, and he would make his speeches sitting on a high chair to make it look like he was standing. He would not allow himself to be photographed in a wheelchair. So when he was photographed, he was oftentimes photographed sitting in a regular chair or standing on a high chair, again to make, well, I say sitting on a really high chair to make it look like he was standing. But as best he could, he tried to cover up his illness, his crippledness. But he was, and oh yes, he built a home in Georgia, Warm Springs, Georgia, where he'd go often, hoping that the warm waters of Warm Springs would help him find a cure, and he would get with other polio victims. Polio was a common disease in those days, and my dad used to scare me when I was young and would get outside and get hot playing and running around and get hot. And that's what would bring on polio, and to some extent he was right. And I would have dreams of getting polio myself, but it never happened to me. But it did happen to some people I knew. Eventually, vaccines were developed that more or less stopped the spread of polio, but polio reoccurred in the 1960s when I was still a kid. So it was still around, and you don't hear as much about it anymore. In 1928, 7 years after being stricken, he became governor of New York. In 1932, he ran for president and won easily. Herbert Hoover made the mistake of ordering the people who were marching on the White House of getting the National Guard and the Marines out to drive them off. When Roosevelt heard the news, he said, I've been elected. He was right. Herbert Hoover made himself extremely unpopular. So he won the 1932 election. His party, though, was badly divided. Your Southern Protestants were at odds with Northern Catholics. The rich in the party did not have much in common with the poor. Nevertheless, the Republican Party was blamed for the Depression, so a Democrat was to win, and the Democrats were to win 5 elections in a row before another Republican finally turned the tide and won an election. All right. He ran on a campaign promise of a New Deal. He was vague about what the New Deal was, but he's associated with this New Deal. It has been said that, like Abraham Lincoln of a couple generations before, he had no plan to deal with a crisis. It's just he hoped to get to Washington, surround himself with some really brilliant economic experts, and he and them work together to figure out a solution. But he really had no idea what to do. The idea of rating a president by his first 100 days in office begins with him. Now, I say 100 days. Again, every president from that day to this has been rated on how do they do the first 100 days. And oftentimes these first 100 days sets the tone for their whole presidency. Most presidents have a period of time called a honeymoon when people treat them with a lot of dignity and respect, but some don't. Some are unpopular with a lot of people from the beginning and remain unpopular. Not with everybody, they could be unpopular with everybody and be president, but some of them just simply cannot be popular with, at least with a certain crowd. Now, I say 100 days. The story is told that when he first got elected, actually his first day in the White House, he went through the inauguration ceremony, got to the White House and said, I'm going to start to work. His secretary went out to party to celebrate. His chief of staff went out to have a big time because, after all, he was now chief of staff. One after another, he tried to call this servant and that servant, and even his janitors were not around. He finally decided enough of this, and he went to bed. But the next morning, they were all there. And he got back to work right away, first thing. He's famous for his fireside chats. Essentially, practically every home in those days had a radio, even the poor. The radios were vacuum tube type. Some of you might know what I'm talking about. They had a hum to them, a regular steady hum. And they also had an antenna that you could touch and use your body as an antenna. The transmitters in those days were weak compared to the ones today, and stations were fewer and farther between. But everybody in America practically could pull in a station. But some Americans, that lived far from the station, had a hard time pulling them in. But the family would gather around the fireside, and oftentimes the father would touch the antenna and use his body and pick up, and those radios were full of static and really noisy, especially during a thunderstorm. The FM radio had not been invented. But people would listen to him talk. I'm going to try to mimic him as best I can. Famous line from his speeches. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Keep in mind, he was crippled, not even affected his ability to talk. He could not stand up, so he had to make his speeches crouched down. My wife tells me I should sit down, but I can't bring myself to sit down while I'm lecturing, with a few exceptions. Very few, but I just simply can't. Anyway, he would have his famous fireside, and he tried to reassure the American people that, hey, everything's going to be all right. Prosperity is just around the corner. What corner? Folk, for the previous class, I wrote down, government action did not end the Depression. Actually, the Depression ended with two things. Number one, when Roosevelt stopped caring and stopped trying to help the poor. And then came World War II, and World War II is given credit for ending the Depression. All right. Come 2 weeks, and I want to have a talk with you about your papers. Makes me realize I need to keep on teaching. The ones of you who turn your papers in are mostly politically correct. I understand that. And you're taking the normal side of the issues. I say normal, the side I'm afraid a lot of Americans are taking. And one of them has to do with government action, but another one has to do with immigration. I want to tell you this much. Foreigners once destroyed the Roman Empire. This is in the records book. And if that's not enough, 3 times foreigners have brought down the Chinese civilization. Genghis Khan did, the Mongolians that is. The Manchu did, and the Mongolians did another time. The foreigners also brought down the civilization of India at least once. All right, that's enough for that for now, but I'm going to have more to say about that in a couple of weeks. All right. Here's part of the New Deal, things that a lot of this was about accomplished in a couple of days. SEC, Securities Exchange. All right, I'm going to talk slower so that you can have a chance to get this down. Securities and Exchange Commission. This was to regulate Wall Street, to regulate banks. He got a tight control on the banks. And weirdly enough, the man who had done the most to help bring down Wall Street namely Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., the father of President Kennedy. He appointed as the head. And there was a man who had broken up Wall Street who appointed him to try to fix Wall Street. I think that was probably a bad choice. But nevertheless, that's what who he appointed. And now don't forget, because we're going to keep running into this again. Later, President Reagan was to deregulate the banking and securities and the savings and loan industry, and the result was we would have two crises, banking crises, one during Reagan's term and one during the George 43's term. The one in George 43 only occurred 11 years ago, and it brought the stock market almost to a crash. Most of you are too young to remember it, but there was a person in the other class who did remember it. Freddie Mae and Fannie Mac, two firms that almost brought the country's economy crashing down. But Securities and Exchange Commission. Now, Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, Federal Emergency Relief, and the purpose of the FERA was what it suggests, relief. Putting people on relief. Now, folks, the Relief Administration was still around when I was younger. What it would do for a person, it would give a family enough money to where they could pay their rent and buy a few clothes and a little bit of food, and that was it. No room at all for luxuries or for anything other than the barest of necessities. It paid a person just the minimum amount that he needed just to exist. Not enough for him to get ahead or to really enjoy living. Now, again, none of you went through this. I went through, I did not go through the Depression, but my dad did, and he talked about it a lot. A lot of my teachers did, and they talked about it a good bit. And anyway, CCC, that is Civilian Conservation Corps. That Civilian Conservation Corps hired young men, and yes, folks, I must say men, hired young men to work in the forest. In other words, these men would go out and camp and get up in the morning from their campsite and work on cleaning out forest, which if we still did, it would probably prevent or keep check on the number of forest fires. But anyway, or set up national parks, conservation. Now here is the problem, the catch-22 about this. All of these men only worked for about 30 days. Now, I can tell you some of this from personal experience, not for me, but my dad. My dad got a government job one time, and he made a good bit of money on it, but he only worked for 30 days. And each of these men who were hired were hoping that somehow the government would find them to be a good enough worker to go beyond 30 days, but very few of them went beyond 30 days. Now, again, the government, if they liked you, if your boss really liked you, they'd keep you on permanently, but that was rare. So they'd work you for 30 days and then lay you off, and you might be laid off at least maybe 90 days before you had a chance to get back on. But it was just a temporary make work thing. CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. The SEC is still around. The CCC is not. This is not either. Now this one is. The TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. The Tennessee Valley Authority is primarily for the southeast, and yes, it's still around. The reason we have Lake Allatoona today and Lake Lanier is all these rivers were dammed up and they made for big reservoirs. The two purposes of it, flood control and cheap hydroelectricity. Now, a lot of the people at that time wondered, is there something in the water that generates the electricity? No, it's as the water flows over the dam, it turns a turbine or turns a big wheel, water wheel, and the turning of the wheel generates the electric current. It turned out, though, that the TVA could not generate enough current for the needs of the people, so a lot of electricity today is generated by nuclear plants. But the TVA provided cheap electricity for Southerners. My grandfather, my mother's side was in Kentucky, Lake Cumberland. Some of you might have heard of the Cumberland River being dammed up. And, the Lake Cumberland, and my grandfather had to move out. The government paid him for his land. He had land down next to a creek. They told him this water is going to rise up the top of your barn. It never got that high, but it did get and flood out all of his land that would have, it was the bottom of his barn, the bottom of his home. But we're using the money that he got from the government. He bought land higher up, and he stayed on that land till the day he died. Now my cousin has the same property, one of my cousins. Anyway, the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. AAA, American Agricultural Association. Wait a minute, I'm sorry, I'll take that back. Agricultural Adjustment Act. I should have known better than that. Agricultural Adjustment Act. AAA. Now, folks, don't get confused. That's not Alcoholics Anonymous. No. AAA. Now, its purpose was to try to get better prices for farmers. Now, here's how it did it. It took a lot of the excess surplus that farmers could not sell and used it for school lunch programs. Now, I don't know if that's still going on, but for many years, school lunches were so cheap. I mean, when I was in the second and third grade, we paid a quarter for a meal, which was cheap even at that time. By the time I was teaching in the early 1970s, kids were paying 45 cents a meal for their lunches, which was, again, very cheap at the time. But school kids could get cheap lunches, but I've got to say this about the school lunch programs. Michelle Obama wanted the kids to only eat healthy food, with the result that the kids were only served good, healthy food, and they wouldn't eat it. And a lot of states now are just deciding we're going to let the kids eat what they'll eat. And they're throwing out Michelle Obama's program, and the people are upset about it. Now, if any of you have any thoughts on the matter, your input is welcome. But my daughter, who's teaching in a public school right now near Athens, says that the kids today do not eat the lunches that are served, with a few exceptions. Yes?
No, that's true. When I was in,
You know that to be true?
Yeah, when I was in, I think it was 9th grade.
Yes.
In my high school, they did it. Oh, not 9th grade, 10th grade. 9th grade, we had all junk food.
Yeah.
And then 10th grade, that's what happened. Nobody's.
Nobody would eat it. Okay, well, that's confirming what I've heard from other, and also newspapers have taken up that story. My wife went to visit school one time and saw it. The kids will not eat the healthy food. I mean, again, you can't retrain your taste buds that well.
I believe that we shouldn't check the healthy food out with the system. They should, because eventually they're going to have to.
You can offer it if you want to, but the kids will not eat it. And unlike those of us who are older, like me, when I was younger, I could skip a meal, but when you get to be pushing 70 like I am, you can't miss a meal. But again, these kids can.
That's why we have obesity, you know.
I know if childhood obesity is a problem. I mean, I know that eventually leads to heart attack, stroke, high blood pressure. I know all, and yet the kids will eat it. I know. What do you do? I mean, folks, it's something I've been trying to tell you the last couple of lessons. When you try to solve one problem, another one creeps up in its place, and oftentimes the problem that creeps up is worse than the one you're trying to solve. Yes.
Yeah, I'm trying to say, I've got a boy in second grade, and then he said, you know what he eats at school, they serve pizza.
That's all he eats is
He won't
pizza.
touch the other meat.
I mean, chicken-
This is typical of what I've heard. Yeah, the kids will not eat what they're supposed to. And again, I reared up 3 children myself, and you know, they'll eat what they want to. I mean, they learned when they're in preschool. When I take them to a restaurant, they tell the waitress, the person behind the counter, what they want. The reason for that is I dated a girl one time who her parents always made her choose before then she got to be an adult and couldn't make up her mind about anything. She eventually married someone else. But anyway, even that's personal. But so I've had my children, they make their own choices. And even if when they're in their 20s, everyone on are in their 20s, I still take them out to lunch sometime, and they know they're going to decide what they eat. They tell the people behind the counter what they want. I keep my trap shut all the time. Keep my mouth shut. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right. Anyway, now here's something else the AAA did. and eventually slaughtered millions of hogs, little bitty pigs, in order to bring prices up. And this made a lot of people really upset. He also paid farmers. Now, most of you aren't farmers. I have farmers on my mother's side. And a lot of my relatives were paid to let their land lie idle and not produce. They had to go to the government. I mean, to get money from the government, you have to fill out a form. They had to go to the government, fill out a form, and describe what land they owned and what land they were not going to, and the government would decide, okay, don't plant this field, don't plant this field. They, okay, not plant. Then they go say, I did not, and they could, I mean, the government had the right to inspect, of course. I did not plant in such and such a field, and the government would pay them for not planting. Again, that was, the idea was to get prices up. The less the farmer grew, the higher the price he got for his produce. Again, it was designed to help the farmer, and as far as I know, folk, this law is still on the books. Paying farmers to not grow, paying people to not work. Agricultural Adjustment Act. Now, both the AAA and the CCC helped the people who did not need help so much. The CCC employed young people who did not have, young men, I have to say men, folk, but young men who did not have families. The AAA gave money to the big farmers who were not hurting as badly as the small farmers. So they helped the people who did not really need the help as much. Again, this is the government for you, government welfare program sometimes. Now, the NRA, National Recovery Association, or National Recovery Act. Now that's not the National Rifle Association. The National Recovery Act.
Are we on NIRA?
I'll get to that.
Okay.
NRA, and yeah, okay, NIRA also, NRA, National Industrial Recovery Act. The NIRA was designed to help industry, the NRA designed to help all people. Again, a lot of your industrial workers did not need help so much. Now, on a personal note, my grandpa Cunningham worked every day during the Depression, but he had to take a pay cut. And he worked for very little, but at least he was able to feed his family during the Depression. But he did not need help as much as the people who were unemployed. Now, your book says, and I feel like I must say it too, black people and American Indians were very, very little helped by the New Deal. And a lot of times the poor people were not helped either. WPA. The WPA built a lot of bridges, a lot of roads, and even when I was a kid, a lot of the bridges in the country still had WPA written, etched in concrete on the side of them. Now, most of your WPA bridges were one lane. That is, when you approached them with your car, you had to stop and make sure there was no car coming on the other end. Then you could cross. And keep in mind, in the 1930s, there wasn't enough cars on the road to warrant building two-lane bridges. Now today, all your WPA bridges have been redone. Now I want to say this, folk, about bridges. Just this week, a major collapse occurred in Chattanooga where an overpass fell down over on the street of the road below it. And I read where that our nation's infrastructure is really bad. 80% of the overpasses and bridges have some defect. I'm not saying they're so defective that they're yet unsafe, but they have a defect that needs to be corrected. We don't have the money to repair them all. And it's been estimated to take 80 years to fix them. Yes?
Did you say what each letter stood for?
The what?
Did you say what each letter stood for?
WPA, yeah, as we've gone through them, yeah. NRA, National
No,
Recovery.
I'm saying the WPA. Did you say what that?
Works Progress Administration. I might have skipped that word. Now, my high school teacher said that WPA should have stood for We Piddle Around. A private industry cannot allow this, folk. But the government does. You know, when you saw WPA workers out working on a road, most of them were sitting around doing absolutely nothing or doing very little. With all respect, in some cases, they couldn't do anything to another person that done his job. Like if their job was smoothing out concrete, well, until the other person dumped the concrete out from a concrete truck, they could not start smoothing. And I ran into this at Lockheed. You could not do your job till a person ahead of you in the line had done his.